Celine's earliest memories weren't the kind filled with laughter and bedtime kisses. No, hers were full of shadows, of whispered arguments that turned into angry shouts, of nights spent curled up under the covers, hoping, praying, that the storm would pass. But it never did. She remembered the night everything changed. She was 5 years old, her tiny hands clutching her favorite stuffed bear, Mr. Whiskers. The house felt colder than usual, even though the air was thick with tension. She could hear her mother's voice rising, trembling with anger and something else, something that sounded a lot like pain. "Who is she, Vincent?" Celine peeked from behind the couch, her little heart hammering. Her father stood across the room, his hands in his pockets, his face blank. He wasn't shouting, wasn't even angry. He just looked tired. "She is the woman I love," he said, his voice quiet but sharp, like the edge of a broken glass. "Unlike you, she understands me." Celine didn't understand everything, but she understood enough. Her mother gasped, stumbling back like she had been struck. "I gave up everything for you," Patricia cried. "I stood by you when you had nothing, and now you're throwing me away?" Vincent didn't flinch. His next words cut through the air like a knife. "I never asked you to." Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Celine squeezed her bear tighter. Something deep inside her cracked, a feeling she couldn't name. Her father left soon after that. He didn't hug her goodbye, didn't ruffle her hair like he used to. He just walked out the door, dragging his suitcase behind him. Celine ran after him. "Daddy." Her voice was so small, so desperate. But he didn't turn back. That was the night she learned a painful truth. Love wasn't always forever. A new life in the shadows. Her mother tried. She really did. But love alone couldn't pay the bills. The big house with the shiny floors was gone. Their new home was a tiny, crumbling apartment in a neighborhood where the lights flickered and the air smelled like smoke and desperation. The walls were thin, and at night, Celine could hear the neighbors fighting, babies crying, and sometimes, when she closed her eyes tight enough, her own father's voice in her head. Patricia worked too hard and slept too little. Some nights, she came home so tired she barely made it to the couch before falling asleep. Other nights, there was no food. Celine's stomach growled, but she never complained. She had learned that complaints wouldn't change anything. And yet, even in the darkness, she still asked the same question. "Mommy, does Daddy miss me?" Patricia always forced a smile. "Of course, my love." But her eyes told the truth. He never called, never sent letters, never came back. Then one day, Celine overheard something she wasn't supposed to. "He has a son now," her mother whispered to a neighbor. "That's the child he wanted." The words hit like a slap. Celine's breath caught. He has a son? A brother she had never met. A child he wanted. And her? She was just forgotten. A child no one wanted. Patricia's health began to fail. She coughed more, ate less, and moved slower. Then one day, she sat Celine down. Her mother's hands, once strong and warm, were now thin and shaky. "I need you to be strong," she whispered. Celine didn't understand. Not until she was sent away. Aunt Grace's house smelled like fried fish and disappointment. She had too many children, too little patience, and no room in her heart for an extra mouth to feed. Celine tried to be helpful. She cleaned. She stayed out of the way. But it wasn't enough. One night, after another argument about money, Aunt Grace turned to her with cold eyes. "You're going to stay with your Uncle Philip." No explanation. No goodbye. Just another goodbye that wasn't really one. Uncle Philip didn't yell. He didn't hit. But he didn't care either. Celine spent most of her days alone in his tiny apartment, watching the dust dance in the sunlight, waiting for a door that never opened for her. Then, one day, the words came again. "I can't take care of you anymore." And just like that, she was packed into another taxi, sent off to another house. Hope and loss. Mama Blessing was different. Her grandmother's hut in the village was small but warm. The old woman's hands were rough but gentle, her voice soft with love. Celine slept in a real bed. She ate warm food. She listened to stories under the stars. For the first time in forever, she felt safe. But happiness never lasted in Celine's world. Mama Blessing grew sick. Her breath became shallow, her hands weaker. There was no money for medicine, no doctor to save her. One cold morning, Celine woke up to silence. Mama Blessing was gone. And Celine? She was alone. Again. Sent away once more. This time, there was no pretending. No warm smiles or empty promises. A distant relative, a woman Celine barely knew, took her in. Aunt Veronica. She was nothing like Mama Blessing. Her house was big but cold. Her voice sharp, her rules strict. Celine was not a child in this house. She was a guest, a temporary burden. She tiptoed through the hallways, careful not to be seen, careful not to be heard. Because in this place, she had learned the hardest lesson of all. She didn't belong anywhere. Celine had never been anyone's first choice. She had been passed from one home to another, forgotten by her father, pitted by her mother, and barely tolerated by her relatives. But when Daniel looked at her, it felt different. For the first time in her life, someone saw her. Not as a burden, not as an obligation, but as someone worth knowing. At first, she didn't believe it. Why would someone like him, a boy who could have any girl on campus, choose her? Maybe it was a joke. Maybe it was a mistake. But Daniel was persistent. He sought her out in the library, waited for her outside her lectures, texted her first thing in the morning and last thing at night. Good morning, beautiful. Sweet dreams, Miss Focused. No one had ever spoken to her that way before. No one had ever cared enough to check on her, to ask how she was doing, to make her feel like she mattered. So when he finally asked, "Why don't we make this official?" Celine didn't hesitate. She said yes. At first, everything was perfect. Daniel made her laugh, made her feel wanted, made her believe, just for a moment, that maybe love wasn't something she had to chase anymore. But love, she would soon learn, was never that simple. It started with little things. "You think too much." The first time he said it, she brushed it off. Maybe he was right. Maybe she did overthink things. "You're too emotional." She tried to be less sensitive, less needy. After all, she didn't want to be too much for him. "You should try dressing up more." She started wearing makeup, changing her style, adjusting herself, piece by piece, to fit the mold of what he wanted. Celine told herself it was normal. Relationships required effort, right? And if she could be better, prettier, easier to love, then maybe, just maybe, Daniel would never leave. But then, the distance began. The morning texts became less frequent. The late-night conversations turned into rushed good nights. He stopped waiting for her after class, stopped noticing when she was quiet, stopped calling her beautiful. And Celine felt it, the shift. The feeling of slipping through someone's fingers, of holding on too tight while they let go. She told herself it was in her head. Daniel was just busy. He had exams, friends, responsibilities. She had to be understanding. But understanding didn't stop the sick feeling in her stomach when he canceled their plans at the last minute. It didn't stop the sharp sting when she saw him laughing with another girl in the cafeteria, his hand resting on her shoulder in the same way he used to do with her. One evening, when she finally gathered the courage to ask, "Daniel, do you still want to be with me?" he sighed, looking at her like she was exhausting him. "Celine, you're too clingy." Clingy. That word rang in her ears long after he walked away. Was she? Was it wrong to want him to look at her the way he used to? To miss him when he pulled away? To want to be enough? But she didn't argue. She didn't fight back. Instead, she swallowed the lump in her throat, nodded, and told herself to be less needy, less emotional, less her. But no matter how much she tried to shrink herself, it was never enough. And one day, just like that, Daniel was gone. No explanation. No goodbye. One morning, he was hers. And by night, he belonged to someone else. She saw them together, the new girl. She was everything Celine wasn't. Confident. Effortless. Someone who didn't have to beg to be loved. Celine wanted to scream, to cry, to demand why. But she already knew the answer. She had never been anyone's first choice. Not her father's. Not her mother's. Not even Daniel's. And standing there, watching him wrap his arms around someone else, Celine finally realized the truth. No one was coming to love her the way she had always dreamed. She was on her own. And for the first time, she stopped trying to be anything else. A love that was never meant for her. At first, Celine brushed it off. The sharp words, the cold glances, the little ways Daniel made her feel small. He still loved her, didn't he? Love wasn't supposed to be perfect. It was about making things work. And she would make it work. But then, the words got worse. "You're lucky I'm with you, Celine. Most guys wouldn't have the patience for a girl like you." Her heart would clench every time he said something like that. But she never argued. She never spoke up. Instead, she tried harder. She became more agreeable, more careful. She apologized even when she had done nothing wrong. She changed herself, over and over, just to make him happy. because she was terrified of losing him. And that fear made her blind to the truth. She was already losing herself. 7 months. That was how long the relationship lasted. 7 months of highs and lows. 7 months of feeling like she was finally loved, only to be torn down again and again. Until one day he left. Just like that. He didn't even try to soften the blow. He told her he had met someone else, that it wasn't working, that she was too much. And then he walked away. Celine had thought heartbreak would feel like sadness, like something you cry about for a few days before moving on. But it wasn't like that. It felt like being ripped apart from the inside, like something inside her had died. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of their relationship, searching for what she had done wrong. She stopped eating properly, stopped smiling, stopped believing in herself. Because if the one person who had made her feel special could leave so easily, then maybe she was never special at all. Maybe she was just as unlovable as she had always feared. And so, she made a decision. She would never let herself be that vulnerable again. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was still desperate for love. And no matter how much she tried to guard her heart, she would keep searching for it in all the wrong places. Michael, the love that slowly faded away. Celine met Michael at a time when she felt lost. She had just graduated from university, and life felt like a giant, empty road stretching before her. She didn't know where she was going, only that she was alone on the journey. Michael seemed like everything she needed, mature, responsible, and sure of himself in a way she wasn't. He was 5 years older, already established in his career, and had a quiet confidence that made her feel safe. They met at a work-related networking event. She wasn't supposed to be there. Her friend had dragged her along at the last minute. She had been standing by the drinks table, feeling out of place, when he walked up to her. "You don't seem like you want to be here," he said, smiling. She looked up, surprised. His eyes were sharp but kind. His suit fit him perfectly, his presence effortless. She forced a small smile. "I don't actually." He chuckled. "Honest. I like that." And just like that, he pulled her into his world. At first, their relationship felt like a dream. Michael was different from the boys she had known in university. He was a man, calm, steady, and put together. He took her on elegant dates, sent her thoughtful gifts, and spoke about the future with confidence. For the first time in a long while, Celine felt like she was part of something real, like she was building something. But as the months went by, little things started to change. It began with small suggestions. "You should wear more form-fitting dresses," he said one evening before dinner. "They make you look more confident." "You don't have to be so opinionated all the time," he remarked after she voiced her thoughts during a conversation. Men like women who are soft-spoken. At first, she thought he was just helping her improve. So she adjusted. She started dressing the way he liked. She toned down her personality to please him. She laughed less, listened more. But no matter what she did, it was never enough. Michael had a way of making her feel like she was always almost good enough. If she spoke up too much, he called her argumentative. If she was quiet, he said she was boring. If she focused on work, he made her feel like she was neglecting the relationship. And worst of all, he dismissed her emotions like they were nothing. "You're too sensitive," he would say. "You always find a problem where there is none." Celine started doubting herself. She questioned whether she was too much, whether she was the problem. The final blow came during a dinner with his colleagues. Someone jokingly asked, "So, Michael, when's the wedding?" Celine smiled, expecting him to say something promising. But instead, he laughed. "Marriage? I'm not thinking about that anytime soon. I still have my whole life ahead of me." Celine's smile froze. Her hands clenched under the table. They had been together for almost 2 years. She had assumed they were working toward something long-term. But to him, she was just a phase. Someone he enjoyed having around, but never truly saw a future with. That night, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like a fool. She had spent 2 years molding herself to fit into his life, only to realize she had no place in it. The breakup wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no tears, no begging, just a quiet conversation where Michael barely looked at her and said, "I think we've grown apart." And that was it. As Celine walked away from Michael, she felt something inside her crack. She had given so much of herself to this man, and still, she was not enough. That realization hurt more than the breakup itself. She told herself she was done with men who made her feel small. She wanted something different. Something passionate. Something real. That was when she met David. And David would be the biggest mistake of them all. The obsession that almost broke her. David wasn't like Michael. He didn't hold back his feelings. He didn't play games. He wanted her, and he made sure she knew it. From the very beginning, he showered her with attention. He called her constantly, sent her sweet messages, made her feel desired in a way she never had before. At first, it was intoxicating. I've never felt this way about anyone, he told her just weeks into their relationship. You make me crazy in the best way possible. Celine felt her walls crumbling. For the first time in years, she let herself believe. But what she mistook for passion was actually control. David's love came with conditions. And soon, she would realize, this love was a prison. The moment he saw the missed call, his entire demeanor shifted. His muscles tensed, his jaw clenched, and the warmth that had filled the room just moments before evaporated. Celine frowned. Is everything okay? Alex forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, just work stuff. She didn't believe him. Over the past few months, she had learned to read him well. And right now, he was lying. He dressed quickly, barely meeting her gaze, and grabbed his phone with a grip so tight his knuckles turned white. I have to go. Celine's heart clenched. Alex, I'll call you later, he said, pressing a quick kiss to her forehead before rushing out the door. She stood there, frozen, as the door clicked shut behind him. Something was wrong. She could feel it deep in her bones. For hours, she tried to ignore the unease gnawing at her. She buried herself in work, distracted herself with errands, but the feeling wouldn't go away. And then the news broke. A body had been found at a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. The victim was identified as a businessman with alleged ties to illegal dealings. Frank. Celine's blood ran cold. She knew that name. Alex had mentioned him before in passing, just a business associate, nothing more. Rushing onto the floor. Hot tea splashed across her bare feet, but she didn't feel the burn. Her eyes were frozen on the name beneath the headline. Alexander Williams. Her breath hitched. No, this couldn't be right. Her fingers trembled as she grabbed her phone, refreshing the news article over and over, as if the words would change. But they didn't. Something about a man found dead in an alley. Something about Alex being connected to the crime. No details. No explanations. Just those terrifying words. Arrested for murder. Celine's chest tightened. Her lungs forgot how to breathe. She scrambled to her feet, snatching her keys off the table. Before she knew it, she was in her car, speeding down the dark streets, the city lights blurring past her. Her hands shook so badly she could barely keep the wheel steady. By the time she reached the police station, her pulse was a wild drum against her ribs. Outside, reporters swarmed the entrance, cameras flashing, voices murmuring. She shoved through them, her only focus on getting inside. At the front desk, she gripped the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. I need to see Alexander Williams, she said. The officer barely glanced at her. He's in custody. No visitors. Her stomach twisted. This has to be a mistake. He wouldn't. Her own voice cracked. She swallowed hard. The officer's face was unreadable. Go home, ma'am. Home. How could she go home when the man she loved was locked away, accused of something he would never do? Celine stumbled outside, the night air slamming into her like a wall of ice. The world around her spun. She pulled out her phone, dialed his number, straight to voicemail. Tears blurred her vision as she stared at the screen. This morning, they had woken up together. Warm, safe, happy. Now, she was standing alone in the freezing night, trying to believe that the man she loved wasn't a murderer. The trial. The courtroom was suffocating. Celine sat stiffly in the wooden bench, her fingers digging into her lap, her nails biting into her skin. Alex sat at the defense table, dressed in a dark suit, his face unreadable. His eyes found hers, but there was something in them that made her stomach drop. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was acceptance, like he already knew how this would end. The judge's voice rang through the silence. The defendant, Alexander Williams, is hereby found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. A sharp gasp tore from Celine's lips. The world tilted. The walls closed in. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't move. Alex turned to her one last time. His lips parted, as if he wanted to say something. But before he could, the guard snapped handcuffs around his wrists. A lump rose in her throat as they led him away. He gave her a small nod. A silent message. Stay strong. Then he was gone. Celine sat frozen, staring at the empty space where he had been, her heart splintering into 1,000 pieces. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But no one woke her up. No one told her it was a mistake. Alex was gone. Forever. The secret she never expected. Days passed. Then weeks. Celine moved through them like a ghost, barely eating, barely sleeping. Nothing mattered anymore. Until one morning, a strange wave of nausea rolled through her stomach. She barely made it to the bathroom before she was sick, clutching the sink, gasping for air. Her hands shook as she gripped the counter. No, it wasn't possible. But deep down, she already knew. A doctor's visit confirmed it. She was pregnant. Alone in this battle. Celine sat in the waiting room, holding the test results in her trembling hands. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. The irony of it all. She was carrying Alex's child, and he would never know, would never hold them, would never see their first steps, would never whisper their name, because he was locked away, and she was alone. The months dragged on, filled with hospital visits, endless exhaustion, and an unbearable loneliness. She wrote letters to Alex, pouring her heart out in ink, but she knew he would never read them. She sat through birthing classes alone, watching happy couples rub their wives' swollen bellies with love. She clenched her jaw, swallowed the pain. She had always been strong. But this was breaking her. Still, she refused to fall apart. Not now. Not when she had someone else to fight for. A new beginning. The contractions started in the middle of the night. Sharp. Unrelenting. By the time she reached the hospital, the pain was unbearable. She clenched the hospital bed, gasping for breath, her body trembling with exhaustion. There was no hand to hold. No voice to whisper, "You can do this." She was alone. And then, a piercing cry filled the room. The sound shattered everything. The pain, the fear, the loneliness. A nurse gently placed the tiny baby in her arms. Celine looked down, and time stopped. The baby had Alex's eyes. The same deep-set gaze. The same strong features. Even the same little dimple on her left cheek. A sob broke from Celine's lips. For months, she had resented this pregnancy. Feared it. Doubted it. But looking at her daughter now, she understood. This baby was the only piece of Alex she had left. Her heart swelled, a fierce protectiveness surging through her veins. She stroked the baby's tiny fingers, whispering softly, "Alexia." Her daughter. Her reason to keep going. Her reason to fight. A promise made in silence. Celine walked out of the hospital, cradling Alexia close to her chest. She was no longer just a heartbroken woman mourning a lost love. She was a mother. A mother who would protect her daughter with everything she had. Love had failed her too many times. It had left her broken. Abandoned. But not this time. She vowed to never love again. Never let another man in. She didn't need love. She had Alexia. And that was enough.